Hi, my name is Nikki Tate, and I'm here today to talk a little bit about where stories come from. We forget sometimes just how interesting our family members are and what great stories they have to tell us. I was really lucky in that I grew up in a family of storytellers, and one of the very best was my grandmother, my Omi. Omi grew up as a small child in Germany, and when she was about 10 years old or so, her family immigrated to Brazil. And they settled in a place in the jungle where there was nothing. And so for the first couple of years that she lived there, she and her father chopped down trees in the jungle and built the rest of the family a house. Now, my grandmother at the time was still a child, and she liked to goof around and play. And she had a very peculiar habit, even as a child, and that habit stayed with her for her whole life. My grandmother would not, under any circumstances, wear socks or shoes, which is okay if you're inside a house and things are fairly safe. But when you are a kid and you're racing around in the jungles, you can get into some trouble, and that's what happened to my grandmother. She was racing around in the jungle with no shoes on, and she jumped over a log and landed on a poisonous snake. Needless to say, the snake was not impressed and turned around and bit her in the back of her calf. Now, it left a nasty hole in her leg, injected poison, and my grandmother knew immediately she was in terrible trouble. Now, there was no clinic, no doctor, no hospital, nothing close to where she was. So she began to hobble and limp and drag herself through the jungle to the nearest house, which happened to belong to another German family, a farmer, who also doubled as the community's blacksmith. Now, he took one look at the leg. He saw my grandmother beginning to sort of sway like this. And he knew that she was in trouble if they didn't stop the poison from spreading through her body. And so he called a couple of his sons, and they were instructed to sit on my grandmother and pin her down on a table. And the blacksmith heated up a poker and burned a big hole in the back of her leg. And it did two things. It cauterized the wound, it stopped the poison from spreading, and it probably saved her life. Many years later, when my grandmother would come to visit us as children, she would ask, "Do you want to hear the story about the snake?" And we, of course, all said no, because it was a pretty nasty story. But at the same time, we really wanted to hear that story, so of course we made her tell it to us again and again. And years after that, when I was thinking about what would be a cool story to put in a picture book for young children, I thought of my grandmother when she was a child and the snake bite and all of that. So I wrote the book. I sent it off to my publisher, and the editor there read the book and said, "You got to be out of your mind. You can't have a horrible incident like this in a children's book. Kids are going to read this when they're 4 or 5 years old. They're going to be traumatized, go straight into therapy, and never come out." And so she sent me back to the drawing board and had me rewrite the book so that it was a little bit more appropriate for a young audience. And the section I'll read is that little piece about the snake bite, and you can see how it changed from the original horrendous incident to something that was relatively safe to put in a small kid's book. Then it's Omi's turn. I watch to see what she's going to pull out of her backpack, camel bells maybe, or a shark's tooth. But she doesn't even look at her backpack. My grandmother, in front of everyone, leans forward and slowly pulls up her pant leg. Everyone can see her sensible sandal. She tugs her pant leg higher until we are all staring at her calf. Everyone gasps at the huge purplish blue-black scar on the back of her leg. It looks as if someone has dug out a hollow and then painted it, and not very neatly either. "Wow, what happened?" Jacob asks. "Snake bite," Omi says, and Ellen covers her eyes with her hands. Even Mr. Thornton, who fought in a war, goes pale. "It happened in Brazil many years ago. I was much younger, not much more than a child myself." Toby and Alicia lean forward, eyes wide, mouths open. "The snake, it was huge!" And she pulls her hands apart to show us how big it was. "It was green and brown with stripes across its back and black and golden eyes." "Where was it?" Alicia asks, leaning so far forward she nearly falls off her chair. "At first it was under a log, which is why I didn't see it right away, but I sure saw it when it struck. Rap!" And she smacks her open palm against her calf, and we all jump back, hearts thudding. "That snake sank its fangs into my leg." "Ew," Chandra says with a shudder. "What did you do?" Mrs. Lim asks, her bottled water trembling in her hands. And Omi opens her mouth and and a bunch of the kids scream right along with her. I nearly leap out of my skin. Even Mrs. Ballantyne squeaks. I'm pretty sure Grandparents' Day has never been this exciting before. I look behind me, as if a snake might be hiding, ready to jump out and bite me. Chandra lifts her feet and wraps them around the legs of her stool. I was miles from home in the jungle. I had to save myself. I pulled out my knife, and Omi's hand flashes this way and that, showing how she sliced at the wound to make it bleed. Then I sucked out the poison and spat it on the ground. Amazing! Can I touch it? Poor Mrs. Ballantyne. Everybody wants to hear more of Omi's stories. Nobody is very interested in the wooden duck Mr. Charez carved and painted himself, even though he's polished the wings so much they practically glow. So next time you're trying to find an idea for a story, talk to the people around you. Ask them, do you have a scar? Because everybody has a scar, and every scar has a great story.